come from this arts background and was trying to impact politics. I had been involved in like actual 2 different eviction cases in San Francisco where like landlords were trying to get me out of a place, and defending my home in the courts, representing myself, which was really dumb, but worked out okay. And long story, I'll tell you someday. And but I, you know, my background was in the arts, and so I wanted to try to figure out a way to bring these things together. They felt like very separate worlds. And Steve Duncombe, one of the other co-founders, was coming with a background as an organizer, and as he says, putting together marches that he didn't even want to go to, you know. So thought that the arts was more exciting, started to incorporate that into his activism, but realized that, you know, it felt fun, but maybe it was just like, how effective was it? And so both of us, you know, if we're going to commit ourselves to this, one, to make sure that it worked out well. And so we went around and interviewed a lot of people. One of those people was Rebecca. We also talked to our board chair, Pat Gerardo, who's one of the other sort of instigators of the center in that photo. And then we started doing trainings based on what we had learned. We learned that a couple of things. One is that all successful activism has been artistic activism. When you look back at history, it all involves some sort of creativity or innovation. And that this combination actually was really powerful. And so Pat was the one that got us to start doing trainings, and we train people all over the world. Now we have more people, and this isn't even all of them, folks based in South Africa, Senegal, Los Angeles, Croatia, New York City and beyond, and have worked on a real range of issues. I'm not even sure this is complete. And all over the world. And what working in this way sort of forced us to do is figure out what was like culturally specific to the United States or to specific regions in the United States, and really get it down to some fundamental ideas that we found work all over the world. And the way that we approach it is like, we have this expertise and have spent years studying how art and activism go together, but all these places around the world, like, really very little experience in those countries. You know, sometimes we would just be arriving, you know, like didn't know anything about it. And then with the issues too, that is not where our expertise lies. So we go in, we work with some people like you that know the region and the culture really well and know the issue really well. And we bring our expertise and the ideas that you leave with both. You leave with the expertise on the issue, the region, the culture, and on the methods around artistic activism. Did I leave anything out, Rebecca?
No, I think that we'd love to hear. We're not able to introduce everyone on the call, but we'd love for you to tell us in the chat your name, where you are in the world, and what sparked your interest in restorative justice, or what you'd like to get out of this session today.
Yeah, and while you all do that, let's talk a little bit about Lindsay, can you tell us about the Center for Restorative Justice?
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much. First, I just want to say thank you to Rebecca and Steve for facilitating today. I'm so looking forward to this time together and next week as well. And appreciate we had interest from people in really all time zones in this process. So thank you for starting the recording so that we can share it with others who aren't able to be here in person. But just wanted to say welcome to everyone on behalf of the National Center on Restorative Justice, which is a partnership between Vermont Law School, University of Vermont, University of San Diego, and the Bureau of Justice Assistance. We're a federally funded project. And this initiative of the Reimagining Justice Restorative Justice Art Gallery is something we started last year. So last November, in honor of Restorative Justice Week. The International Restorative Justice Week takes place at the end of November each year. And we had been talking a lot about, part of our mission is advancing restorative justice, kind of increasing awareness of restorative justice, the power, the potential of the process, so that we can see greater implementation across the country and, around the world. it's difficult to explain. Restorative justice is this, radically different philosophy and approach to harm, to crime and conflict. And what we were, noticing, and others are noticing as well, this was, born out of conversation with other restorative justice advocates, kind of, especially from the European context, is there's these images that help us to understand what's more conventional approaches to justice, how they're characterized, like, Lady Justice or a courtroom, or kind of the scales. And we don't have the same kind of rich symbolic language around restorative justice, other than kind of the image of a group of people sitting in a circle. So last year we started with just inviting images, images that communicate a restorative approach to justice making. And this year we decided, let's go bigger. Let's ask for really any medium, any kind of creative form of representing and advancing restorative justice. And we are really grateful for the opportunity of this workshop to just help everyone in kind of our wider restorative justice community to kind of think more creatively about how can we be drawing on art and the ability that art has, like, evoke emotion and kind of give an experience more than just a verbal explanation of a process ever will be able to really advance restorative justice, advance this work and the understanding of this work. So we're grateful for this opportunity, and we're still a relatively new center, the National Center, and so it's also a lovely way to be fostering connections with all of you here. So thanks for being here.
Great.
Yeah, you had another slide, Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is from your website and includes this kind of sentence at the end about the invitation and the call for artists. But I love what you were talking about in terms of really wanting to create these richer symbols and narratives for this space. And we know how important that is. And we'll talk about that a little bit, about what is the, cultural change look like, and why is that so critical for other kinds of change in terms of legislation and everything else. So thank you. If anyone has questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat. I see that people are introducing yourselves. So thanks for doing that too. So we can see who's here. Very interesting group. Next, we wanted to share a little bit about artistic activism. As Steve said, we've done a lot of research and working with people around the world, and we like to gather examples of effective and very different kinds of artistic activism to share as inspiration, and to share as something that will provoke you to think about all the different kinds of things that you could do. So we should say, though, that the examples are not comprehensive at all. These are such a small little sliver of things that we've just picked out a couple of things for you today. Also, we wanted to say that these particular ones won't work for you. And we say that because the context really matters, right? Like, these are made for a particular time and place and audience. However, we're showing them to you because creativity, I'm sure, as you know, comes from combination. And so they're really here for inspiration to draw from, to draw some ideas and principles that you might use in your own work. So yes, let's get going. Steve, do you want to talk about Conflict Kitchen?
Yeah, so this is a project based in Pittsburgh, and it's in a neighborhood where there wasn't a lot of places to get food, and it's done by a few people, mainly led by a guy named John Rubin. And what he did was set up this window where you could buy very affordable food, like that you could walk away with, right? Like street food. But they changed the theme of the restaurant, I think, every 6 months or so, but they only serve food from countries that the United States was in conflict with. So the top left is Cuban, the top right is Iranian, the bottom left is Afghan, and the bottom right is Venezuelan. So they did a few things in addition to this. I mean, it's a beautiful storefront, of course, but they wrap the food in these documents, and the documents included kind of like first-person testimony about what it was like to live in that place, kind of more everyday things, not, the tallest building is this and the population, but like what it's like to actually live there and different elements of the culture. and then also people who were living in the United States that were from those countries and their experiences. So you got this food and then it was wrapped in this information. And so it was a way of like, you know, humanizing what a nation that the United States was in conflict with, that, you know, it's not going to get that kind, you're not going to get that kind of representation or story from the nightly news. So there's a couple ideas here that I think are worth drawing from. One is providing multiple ways in, right? So including through the stomach. So people need food. There's this need already, like, and that's an access point. People understand the food and say, oh, this is delicious. And then also the document provides more, but they went on beyond that. And so they provided cooking classes for local young people on how to make the food that were taught over video conference by people in those countries, so that they had like kind of direct interaction with them. And then they would hold dinners too, sometimes across the country. So they would set up a table in Pittsburgh and another table in Iran, and create this really long table, right, with the projector. And then they also gave presentations about, you know, from people that were in those countries or from those countries about it, and had these really amazing interactions and over food where people could sit around and talk about what it's like to live in these different places. This is called the Palestinian potluck. This is a huge dinner that they hosted in New York. And another kind of thing you can take from this is like, these are genuinely fun social experiences, you know, that are community driven and as heavy as the issues are, you know, like we were at war with Afghanistan for many years, and there's a lot of like death and violence and sad things to focus on, and that's not ignored, but surrounding that is a genuinely fun social experience. So Rebecca, you want to talk about Macedonia?
Yeah, well, so right, we've been working for the past few years in the Western Balkans, and specifically in North Macedonia a bunch, which honestly I didn't know where it was before we started working there. It's right north of Greece. Yep. And yeah, right there. And the work that we were doing there was with some people who were artists. And so they were doing work around contemporary art. And they were kind of bringing contemporary art to these really small towns throughout North Macedonia. And they would come to these places, and sometimes people would say to them, we don't want your art. Our town is falling apart. Like the art is nice and all, but could you help us with these fundamental problems? Like we have infrastructure issues, we have potholes, we have these enormous problems. And it's true, the infrastructure is a real mess in North Macedonia. It's a place where corruption has been ubiquitous for decades, really. And the people there feel really cynical about it. They feel really apathetic. They are not protesting. They're very frustrated with it, but they're not protesting it.
And there's good reason, like there's no response when you protest.
No response, right.
People don't show up and the government doesn't respond because everyone else is like, what are we doing? Why? You know, nothing's going to happen.
So these artists that we know knew that the government would actually respond to public pressure in the right way if they could create it. But, you know, how can you get people to a protest when they're feeling so cynical about the government? So what they did is they used their kind of creative skills as artists, but applied them in this really different way. And so what they did is they held a fishing contest in the biggest of the potholes. So they would go with all of their fishing gear, their big boots, and they would have these buckets. Then they would have these big fish that they would put into the pothole, and then they would get them out of the pothole, you know, with their nets and everything, and say, we caught a fish. And people thought this was hilarious. You know, whole towns would show up to watch this ridiculous thing. It's also a very small country, and this sort of thing hadn't been done before. And so it was covered in the news, both the local and the national news. And the mayors in these towns where they did this fixed the potholes. because of this public pressure. They also did something similar with rubber ducks. And this was in front of a school. And so they put these rubber ducks in all these potholes. The kids came and played with them. The cars started to avoid that area. They took photos and they went everywhere on social media. Also, rubber ducks are a symbol of corruption in the Western Balkans. So
can't remember why, but it
yeah.
is.
Yeah, but it's for real. So everyone knows that. And so even just the act of these rubber ducks like played into these very deep local cultural stories and symbols, which everyone understood. And so they put these rubber ducks in the road. 3 days later, the road was fixed. And actually this team, the work that they did, all of these interventions you can see might cost a couple of dollars. All these interventions in North Macedonia over the course of about a year resulted in millions of euros worth of infrastructure money spent to fix things that should have been fixed before. So simple can work, right? Like simple, very small, low cost, but there were some key elements that were very participatory. They shifted the conversation too.
Yeah, so these aren't like masterpieces of artworks, you know, you're just putting rubber ducks in a
Right.
puddle and taking a picture of it, but it worked.
But they're very creative, and they're creative because they're really, you can see that these artists had a real understanding of their audiences. And, you know, they knew that people were pretty cynical about protests, but they found new ways for them to show up in a way that felt safe. The next picture, I think, is actually from, they would throw birthday parties for potholes, like, oh, it's 2 years old, you know, and they would have cake and balloons, and people loved showing up to this. It didn't read like a typical protest. It was very different. And so they changed the conversation and actually got people to protest about other stuff. And it was because they used these really creative kinds of interventions. And you might have seen actually now all over the world, there are all kinds of really creative pothole interventions that we've seen as well. So part of this is like cultivating the desire, right, from these local people. So they already were feeling frustrated, but cultivating the desire to actually go out and protest and creating a welcoming place to do that was really key to the success of this.
So I mentioned before that in beginning the Center for Artistic Activism, one of the things that we did is kind of look back at history and tried to figure out where it started, you know, and at first it was like, oh, well, the WTO protests in Seattle in the late 90s, like they had these spectacular costumes and it was done a different way. Maybe that's where it started. And we said, no, actually, if you go back before, ACT UP was doing really creative theatrical things, creating these objects and thinking about things in a different way. And then we just kept going back and back. Oh, the civil rights movement. No, they used a lot of this stuff, and the suffragettes in the 20s. And then, you know, we eventually got back to Jesus and Moses and all the Abrahamic religions involve, you know, like story and song and all these things. And that's how we sort of came to the conclusion that the most successful or all successful activism is artistic activism. But for now, what I want to talk about is like the civil rights movement, because it's arguably one of the most successful activist campaigns in US history. From the mid 1950s to the late 60s, it involved tens of thousands of people and changed civil rights for millions. But it was also a very consciously creative campaign. And we remember it often like this, masses of people led by, you know, a shining star of courage and righteousness in the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And King was brave and King was righteous, amazing person, no doubt. But his and the movement's power and efficacy was very communal and cultural. And so we can look back to Black churches and the role that they played in creating that, right? So they had an institutional role. It was really important that the churches offered a sort of inherent organization and leadership for the movement that was already there that they could kind of attach to. But there was also a cultural one. There were songs that served as a soundtrack to the civil rights movement that came from spirituals, and there's solidarity that comes in singing them together. There was creative material there that they could use. in the images and narratives to imagine a struggle against these really great odds. Like those stories are in the Bible, the possibility of arriving at a promised land, the story of Moses and slaves fleeing from bondage. These were metaphors that they could kind of, that were already there, that they could attach to. And then there was a stage that the church provided to collectively perform these acts of creation and imagination. So every week, the church provided a stage where a different society, one that wasn't controlled by white supremacists, was enacted in that small space for that time. So one of the ideas here that we can use is like building from cultural foundations. As activists, we never are able to start at ground zero, like in a whole new culture, and make it the way that we want it. And we can't make something from nothing. We're always drawing on the repository of meanings and images and words that already exist. This is what makes changing culture so hard, is that we're stuck in the culture that we want to change. I'm sure you're aware of this in the restorative justice thing, like how people think about justice and right and wrong. Like there's so many harmful stories that already exist. We can't wipe those out and start over. We have to work with those. But even in the most oppressive societies, there are pockets of countercultures or different ideas, repositories of resistance that are not always politicized, but can be. And those stories and the songs, the cultural institutions, the kind of legends and myths and all these things are things that we can build upon. And they did that in a great way in the civil rights movement. So you guys know this picture. I was taught about Rosa Parks in school. And the story that I was told in school was Rosa Parks was this very brave person who, she was a seamstress, and one day she got on the bus and she was tired, and this white guy asked her to move, and she said no, and she was not going to move, and that kicked off the bus boycott. And some of this is true, but Rosa Parks was not some innocent seamstress like that one day just decided to do this. She was a very experienced activist. She was a political organizer. Her grandfather was a Garveyite and organized around defending the Scottsboro Boys in the 30s. She became the local secretary of the NAACP. She was trained at the Highlander Center. And she went on to be political in Detroit, fighting against the Vietnam War, and a supporter of Black Power and a fan of Malcolm X. So she's this super political person, and she refused to move knowing full well what she was doing and the ramifications. So it was planned. And in a way, you could say it was a staged performance. Now, when I say staged performance, we think of staging as being fictional, right? You're telling a fiction. She was staging a performance of a reality. So she's consciously creating this epic moment and this story. Now, there's even this image, like you guys know this image, right? Like everyone has seen this image before. And this wider image with the guy behind it. Now, as a kid, I saw this and I was like, who's the guy, right? Who's this guy? This is the racist guy who told her to move, and then he had to sit behind her. But if you think about it, it's like, why would he stay to be photographed? Like it doesn't make any sense. So this image was taken more than a year later. And it was taken on December 21st, 1956, which was the day that the United States Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery's segregated bus system was illegal. So there was this big event, and the press said, we need a picture. And so they've got, this one, and then they're like, we need some context to tell this story. And they put this AP reporter behind her to sort of to show, right, this scene. Now, again, you could say it's staged, but she is crafting an image for the press to tell this story, right? She's thinking about pictures and how to communicate visually. And there are so many examples of this within the civil rights movement, of them thinking about what is the picture we need to show this, to show the things that happen behind the scenes, to show the things that happen in the middle of the night. And they performed it, right? They performed the reality. It was true that she was a seamstress. It was true that she was tired. It was true that she could not sit in front of the bus. But her act was a performance to dramatize the reality of the racial inequality to a larger world that didn't know or didn't care. So again, we often think of performance or staging as creating a fantasy, and it can be that, but it's also useful to visualize and act out the reality to help the people understand the truth. So here are some more of those images. I think nowhere in the history is that performance of a reality better demonstrated than in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's campaign to desegregate Birmingham in 1963. So many of our images of the brutality of Southern racism and the civil rights movement come from that demonstration. So we've got images here of men being attacked by police dogs, school children being marched off to jail as part of the Children's Crusade, and protesters being assaulted by fire hoses. So everyone knows these pictures, but what's less well known is that that campaign to desegregate Birmingham was staged twice. So a year earlier, they tried to do a similar protest in Albany, Georgia, and it didn't work because the police very simply and peaceably arrested everyone and then moved them to different jails around the state, kept them for different amounts of time, and then released them like a few at a time. So there was no images of the clash, right? There really, in a way, there wasn't a clash. And when you have no images, you have no story. So they kind of regrouped and they're like, we need to show what this looks like. And so they picked Birmingham, learning from that experience, because one, Birmingham had a long history of labor organizing. They also had these recent spate of church bombings, and because of Bull Connor. So Bull Connor was the acting police chief. He had kind of been voted out of office. He's also known as like a belligerent racist. He was a lifelong, or Ku Klux Klan member when he was younger. And so they were anticipating, one, that he would overreact, and two, that he would overreact because he had nothing to lose. And three, that's who he was, right? So they kind of cast him as the role of the villain, and he played it perfectly. So the result was the images we know now, images of Black decency and courage, people in their best dressed clothes, and white violence and racism. And the reason this was brilliant is because it was broadcast around the world. So these images, this is the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, right? And the United States is trying to say we're the free country, and they're those horrible communists in Russia are the ones that are oppressing their people. So these images, as they went around the world, were incredibly embarrassing to that story. And 1 year after the Birmingham campaign, the Civil Rights Act was passed. So it definitely contributed it, I've at the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, if you've ever get the chance to go, it's incredible. And if you've been, but they have images of newspapers in Japan with these pictures on the front page, just images in Russia with these pictures on the front page. So so they knew, like, we need to, as we say, make the invisible visible, right? Not to say that these things weren't invisible. They were very real and vivid for the people experiencing them, but for the wider world and for the federal government, they could pretend it was invisible. And so they brought this out into the forefront. So let's keep going. Another aspect of this that people had a hard time seeing, or because it was hidden from public sight, or it was abstract to conceptualize, was like the ability to not be served and this kind of segregation, right? So sit-ins were a way of showing demonstrating that, right? Like showing we are not able to be served, and this is kind of ridiculous. The first one was at I mean, you can go back to one in 1955 in Baltimore and another one in 1939. But when this really kicked off was in 1960 at a Woolworths in Greensboro. And again, they're creating a picture, patiently waiting to be served. And making sure that it is photographed, right? Because if they go in there and it's not photographed, they're just putting themselves at risk. And they understood the risk. This is a picture from, I think, Birmingham, where the people doing the sit-in were accosted and basically, you know, humiliated, yelled at, had things poured on top of them, food poured on top of them. But what a lot of people don't realize, you may have seen this image before, and I only learned about this recently, is that they rehearsed this. Like, so not only were they thinking about it as a performance, but they rehearsed the performance. Because if someone, I mean, you can only imagine sitting at that table and having a crowd of people yelling at you, calling you all kinds of names, and pouring food on your face. So they practiced it. And these are pictures of those rehearsals. So they would meet at a university, get together, and practice having smoke blown in their face, being yelled at, and just trying to sit there and keep a completely straight face to prepare themselves, because they needed to present this image of dignity, right? And when you watch these videos, it's really beautiful. Like they're all there, they clearly know each other and are friends, and they're like, okay, let's try it, you know. And a few of them will stand there and try to keep a straight face, and they just start yelling insults at them. And then after, you know, 20 seconds, they just start cracking up, you know, because they're friends or they can't do it. And you can tell there's this real sense of camaraderie and support there to prepare themselves for what was coming. So as a friend of ours, David Solnit, once said, all protest is theater. The problem is that most of it is bad theater. And so when you think about these kinds of actions, it's important to think about like blocking where the sight lines are, what images you want taken, knowing your lines when the press asks what it is that you're doing this for. Create like tableaus and imagery for the press, for people, and make your protest good theater. One of the things that we always say is that theater has, like, you know, a story has a beginning, middle, and end. And if you don't plan a beginning, middle, and end to your protest, then the police get to decide the end. And so to think about how it starts, how the story is told and how it ends. And I'll just say too that these really smart innovations, they become tradition and they become less effective. So what a lot of people see is, oh, okay, you know, you sit down and you take up space and then they have to yield to your demands, right? But that's not the process. There's a creative process that went behind that image on the left that doesn't happen when you have people later in years that follow trying to recreate that picture on the left, right? It's not the final tactic, it's the thought and the planning and the creativity that goes into it that makes it successful. So a lot of what we talk about is like breaking these traditions.
We wanted to tell you two more short little stories about creativity being used effectively in activism. The next one is from Bogota, Colombia. And in 1995, Antanas Macas was elected mayor of Bogota, but he had this huge problem, which was there were a very high number of traffic deaths from traffic accidents in the city because people were just not obeying traffic laws. There had been past attempts to hire more cops and give people higher fines, and just none of it was working, and it was egregious. It was terrible how many people were dying and being injured in the city. So he was this creative guy, and he came up with something pretty unusual as a solution. He asked all the traffic cops to leave their jobs, and he said, I'll hire you back if you want, but I'm only hiring people who will be mimes and clowns and direct traffic dressed this way. And so he hired a bunch of very talented mimes who would basically go out onto the streets, and they would make fun of people who were breaking the traffic laws. Like they would walk behind people like in these very silly walks as they were jaywalking, or cars would come up and try to go through the light and they would make fun of them. And what happened is it worked. Within, I think it was 6 months, the traffic fatalities dropped by 70%. And it worked because Antanas Makas knew something about the people of his city, which was that they just did not want to be shamed in this way, that they wouldn't necessarily respond to the laws or to more enforcement, but they would definitely respond to this kind of shame. And right, so playing to your audience's strengths and weaknesses was really key here. This wouldn't work in New York City, right? At all. But it would there, because it provoked these feelings in the audience that really led to them changing their behavior, which is key too, right? This creative action was not just raising awareness about the problem, it was, or getting media attention for it. It was really about creating behavior change, distilling the problem and bringing it to life and immediately creating the change that he wanted to see. And it really worked. And then there have been other cities where variations on this have happened. Like I think there's one where people dress as zebras.
In Peru, yeah.
In Peru, yeah. And so there have been places when it works. And I think there have been places where people try something like this and it doesn't. So again, the context really matters as well.
So this is another project that we actually worked on in 2014. We were working with LGBTQ activists and Roma people in Macedonia. And this was at a time of this kind of rise of right-wing nationalism in the country. So this is a nationalist rally in the main square. That big statue in the middle is new. It's, you know, former Yugoslavia country. At the time, it was known as the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, because they were in this dispute with Greece about the name, which will be important in a minute. But you know, they were really trying to establish that they were their own country and separate from Greece. And so they kind of knocked down all the old Yugoslavian kind of architecture and built these Roman columned, you know, Greek columns and statues of all the heroes of the city. And of course, all those heroes are men. And like the images of the statues of women are like them nursing. It's really bad. So the LGBT folks there, LGBTQ folks were felt really alienated in this, and they had other literal effects. So at their Pride Parade, it was like very common for them to be attacked, have things thrown at them, and there were laws and that were enacted to or they were trying to, that would like prevent people from getting healthcare and things like that. So in working with them over the years, if you feel attacked, I think it's a real natural response to want to kind of fight back. And in this case, doing that and being more aggressive in response just sort of helped alienate them further. It played into the message of the right-wing nationalists, which was like, these people aren't actually part of this country. You know, they're not true Macedonians. And so we asked them, like, well, what do you really want? What's the ideal best case scenario? And they said, well, we would want to form our own country, like a new country. Like this one's kind of screwed up, you know? So we said, okay, let's try that. And so we created a new country, and we made a passport for it. And we set it up in the park for 2 hours on a Saturday in the capital city, in the main park. And we created a new country called the Future Republic of the Former Republic of Macedonia. And this was a country that was based on love. And so we set up a border, and you can see we don't defend the border very well. It's just that gate, that's a threshold that says enter in Macedonian. And there was a border guard. She has police on one side and heart on the other. And when people would enter the country, she would blow the whistle and say, we have a new citizen, and everyone would applaud. And their documents, you know, you'd fill out your information, and the gender was a quadrant, and we encourage people to only fill it out in pencil in case tomorrow you felt differently. So these like subtle clues about what we were doing. We also set up a podium so that people could become statues in our country, and they would be heroes of our nation for whatever reason that they chose, and they could fill it in on this piece of paper. So we, for this short time, kind of built the country that we wanted, and this ended up being one of the most, the most widely attended event that they had thrown in years. It was like we lost count at 600 people. Everyone in the park kind of wanted to see what was going on and hang out in there. And while they were hanging out, there's music playing and there's snacks and people talking. And then you might see like 2 women holding hands, or 2 men might kiss here and there. And you got to experience like, oh, this isn't actually how they describe it on TV, right? So we gave people that experience for that short time. And this is a quote from Audre Lorde. Poetry forms the quality of light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change. First into language, then into an idea, then into a more tangible action. So this performance, this sort of thing that we did on that day, and art in general, can be a place where we rehearse our dreams, where we can make them visible and act them out. And then crucially put some of those impossible dream-like, ideas into action. And one of the nice sort of codas to this story is that within a few years, that regime was removed, and removed by like some really intense artistic actions by people there that involved like thousands of people, and were a lot of fun. So they eventually did succeed, but I think that articulating and imagining what they wanted was a big part of that. So
yeah, so there are dozens and dozens more examples that we would love to show you actually if we had time, but they're in all different mediums, they're from all over the world. We just wanted to show you some. And actually, we wanted to ask some of the things that you see in them. We mentioned some of the kind of principles that we see at work there, like making the invisible visible, or using like really simple and direct tactics. And I wonder if there are things that you see that are in common among these, or that you find interesting. You could write in the chat if you'd like. Comedy. Yeah.
That was a follow-up note.
The group enjoyed the process. That's such a good point, Dwayne, about the pleasure in it, right? Like a lot of them are about joy. They have joy kind of at the core. And they're transforming anger and disappointment into something else, and they're becoming something really welcoming in the process, right? Community building through planning and performing and solidarity. A lot of play, totally. Yeah, they're really playful. Emotional connection. Yeah, words are not always the most effective ways to persuade. I'm sure many of you have heard the research about it's especially around like climate change, like putting data in front of people who already are climate deniers doesn't convince them. In fact, it further entrenches them in their ideas. And so what's key is really the emotional connection and connecting in terms of values. Lots of planning, totally. Yeah, lots of logistic coordination, lots of collaboration between lots of different kinds of people. Really like a play, right? Like all of these are kind of like mini plays.
Deanne has a good one here, which is space to lighten up on our fears and reconsider the things we've been told. We'll probably talk about this a little bit, but there's a moment when you're surprised when you have to make sense of something again, and when people are comfortable, they're more in a position to kind of reconsider things as opposed to being defensive or, again, feeling attacked.
Kathleen says courage and risk taking, which is such a good point. I think that there's creative risk too, also, of like putting something out there that's a little weird and strange. And then there's riskiness that really varies depending on the culture and the time and place, of course, like with the civil rights movement. not a one size fits all. Yeah.
I think that
depends on
goes
the-
back to our
Right.
3 important lessons, right? So sometimes people see these and they go, oh, yeah, we could make our own country in the park. And it probably wouldn't have the same effect, because what they did in Macedonia, it's a very specific moment. You could even do that again now and it wouldn't have the same impact, because the country has changed so much. So moment, location, culture, all these things, but these
you still can
principles.
take, right, like
Yeah.
that idea of creating the reality that you want to see, like thinking about restorative justice, like how do we evoke and really manifest what that looks like for people so that they can better understand it. Like that's a great thing to take from that example.
Yeah, how do you do that for an afternoon and let people experience it, right? So we like to say that it's not about recipes. You can't take any of these actions and try to do them again, like take the ingredients, stir them together with your issue, and then put it in the microwave and you got your new thing. Because that's not what it's about. I think we think about it more like making chefs, right? So a good chef is always trying to gather new ingredients to inspire their dishes, like always looking at different kinds of things that are out there in the world. What's in season, what's sort of tired that could use an overhaul. And they dream up new and unexpected combinations of those ingredients. And they also do a lot of experiments and tests. If you've ever tried to like even perfect an existing recipe, it takes some time, but especially if you're developing your own or making your own tweak, like first try is probably not when that comes out the best. So it takes experimenting and testing to create these kinds of new inventions. But that's our intention, is to like turn you into the kind of chefs that can make actions, make projects, make campaigns that no one's ever thought of before by drawing on all this different culture and these ideas.
And some of those principles that we pointed out through those examples are from all these years of research and working with groups around the world. They're taken from things that we've seen really work, and we use them as prompts. So as people are thinking about, what do I want to do about this issue that's creative, we can use these to say, are there more ways with your action to cultivate more desire among your audiences? Like, what do they want? What motivates them? And how can you feed that through what you're doing? Or how can you use more popular culture that's hyper local in order to inform this? So these become ways that we can refine and make our work like much more engaging and powerful. But so that's kind of what we think about when we think about what makes for good artistic activism. But we wanted to talk a little bit about what people often think artistic activism is. They might think like an artist would go to an organization and say, I've got an idea, like I'd like to paint a mural about climate change in this city. Or maybe the organization goes to the artist and says like, we've got a campaign about climate change. Could you make a mural about it? Or a sign or a pamphlet or a song even, right? Mm-hmm. But the way we think about it is kind of different. We don't think that you can kind of put together an art medium and an issue and it automatically becomes artistic activism, because when we think about artistic activism, we're thinking about something that has impact on the world.
So this is the noun, artistic. We're doing activism. We want outcomes. We want to have it to have effect, but we want to do it in a creative way because we know that that's more effective. So one thing to kind of be clear about is that we're not talking about capital A art, things that are in museums, things that are done by artists who have training, right? Some of the best people that we know that do this work have no formal background in the arts or theater or music or anything like that. The creativity that you have in your everyday life is what's required. So what I mean is, if you have kids, you kind of have to be creative, like in playing games with them and stuff. If you know how to throw a good dinner party, when to turn on the music, when to change it, when to like bring out this thing, when to serve dessert, how to keep a conversation going, like that is what's going to make you a good organizer. How to lay out a garden, right? Like all these things that we maybe don't think of as capital A art, but involve creativity, like that's what we're talking about. Right. And it's because art has these incredible abilities.
Right. If you look at the powers of art, so social scientists have studied this, like really examined what is it that art can do and has done that's powerful. And we know some of these things, like, so art helps humans express feelings and ideas that otherwise can be really difficult to put into words. It also helps create purpose and meaning. And the arts connect people, as you know, through shared experiences, and it can really help situate abstract, big, complex ideas through personal and relevant stories that resonate people and that they remember much, much later. Art helps people learn. So scientists who are looking at how do people best learn, think about and have studied how art does this in particular. So it can be very effective at engaging and distilling these complicated ideas and problems. It can also do something important, which is challenge habits and certitude through surprise and cognitive dissonance, which is critical if you want to pop people out of their ruts that they've gotten into in terms of ways of thinking about things like climate change or justice. Art can frame familiar problems in new ways. It also does something wonderful, which is it can enchant people, invite participation, welcome people in, bring that joy in a really intuitive and visceral way. It can engage all of the senses, and also because of that, all of the sense-making capacities, and provide opportunities for synthesis and personal meaning making. So that is really powerful. So if you're a painter, for example, and you look at some of the examples that we shared and you say, I don't see myself in there, I'm not sure how my painting fits into the kinds of examples that we give. We also want you to remember that you're an artist, and we all really are creative, and we all can tap into these powers of art. And so when we come back from the break, I think we'll talk about some particular ways that we can do that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, thinking about restorative justice and getting people to understand exactly what you mean. And Lindsay, you kind of talked about all the work, the background, like how much it takes to get people to kind of really deeply understand this. Like these kinds of powers that art has are going to be really critical to that and really helpful in moving people on that. So to tap into all the powers of art that we just mentioned, it's really important to start with objectives, as opposed to starting with like, I'm going to make a mural, or I'm going to make a poster, or a meme, or whatever it is, right? Instead of thinking about how you're going to get it done, think about what it is that you need to get done. So,
right, you might want to make a really beautiful painting about restorative justice, and that's fine. And we'll talk after the break about how paintings or how these different art forms can be part of creating the change that you want to see. There are strategic ways to make that happen.
Yeah, but no matter what your expertise is, starting with, okay, what do we want to get done? And then kind of working backwards, and then you have all different kinds of skills as an artist beyond mastery of a medium. You know, there's a way that you think, there's a way that you approach things that is going to be helpful. Yeah, so we're going to talk a lot about getting really clear on objectives, because in our experience, that's what opens up the creativity. Knowing exactly as close as you can what it is we're trying to get done makes it easier to solve those problems, and more creative, right? So yeah, we'll go into that more, but should we talk about what we just did, Rebecca?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we said who we are, and then we also talked about artistic activism and some examples, and some of the principles that we can draw from them. So after we come back from a short break, we'll talk about this creative campaign, the objectives, and how that fits into it, and also give you some ideas about what you could do next.
And how long of a break?
Let's take until 5 minutes after the hour.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
I'm going to put up a timer for us.
Yeah.
So. See you soon. Oops.
Hello.
Okay.
Yes, here we are.
Oh, I recorded that whole break.
Oh, excellent.
Didn't get the very beginning, but we got that. So
So I think we wanted to talk about Utopia a little.
yeah, we've got the creative campaign, creating smart objectives as promised. And the mission. Oh, we had that timer. Okay, never mind. So let's talk about Utopia. I'm caught up, Rebecca.
Great, awesome. So
yeah, we wanted to ask you guys to kind of think through, if everything went great, what's the world that you want to see when it comes to justice? You know, like best case scenario, you have all the resources and all the power and you can kind of implement it. There's no backlash. What do you want?
And actually, what we're going to do is create a couple of breakout rooms so you have some time to discuss in smaller groups what you think the world will look like. Should we say 2020, 2030?
Yeah.
If everything goes beautifully, we're talking about like beautifully. Everything that you want to see happen has happened.
And there will be a moment when you or someone in your group is like, well, come on, let's be realistic. And you need to tell that person, no, that's not what we're doing right now. We're imagining the world we want when everything goes great.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to open the rooms. Please go ahead and have a short discussion for about 5 minutes. And then we'll want to hear when you come back some of the things that you saw in that future. Okay. Or we could pause the recording.
Using, oh.
Hello.
Deanne was sharing about the charrette process, which I have yet to learn about, but using more community dialogue to address community problems. And then there were a couple of us who spoke to challenging the adversarial system, like upending the adversarial system with a system that encouraged all of us to take responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, this is very restorative justice minded, but this ability for us to be proactive in our responsibility taking instead of denying or hiding from responsibility. And that would need to encompass both harm towards humans and other species and the planet. And then we also heard about what a utopia with true equity. So like, what would true equity really look like, and a system not based on capitalism that benefits from taking advantage, in particular, of Black and brown bodied people.
So the question I would ask is like, what happens when you do all that? Like, what happens after that? And you don't have to answer this, but but to think about, like, when we ask utopia, like the term restorative justice probably wouldn't exist. It would just be justice, or maybe it doesn't even need to be said at all, right? So yeah, keep thinking, keep going with some of that, and like think about what the results would be. But thank you. That's I mean, I think the things you're getting to are where we're going, you know? So
I can answer your question.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah.
It would just be like, life would just be a dance party. There would be so much dancing and good food.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm feeling it. I see it.
Now we're getting there. Okay. let's hear from another group.
This is Jessica. I'll go ahead and jump in for our group if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a perfect segue because we had the same, very similar thoughts. Starting with Dwayne talking about equity, that there would be this existence of equity, but taking it a step further, that wouldn't even have to be a thought. Like, again, to the sense of RJ wouldn't have to be used because it's just justice. Equity would just not be even a thought because it wouldn't need to be. Also expanding on that very similar to what Kathleen was describing for her group, that moving to a relational way of being instead of self-centered or self-focused, that it's more relational instead of that ego-centered, being connected to one another. Another thought was that no one needs for anything, that we're just sustainable, that we're living in a sustainable environment that's just naturally functioning together.
Right.
Also realizing, I'll say too, that we also struggled to even expand on that a little bit more, or even begin the thought process, because recognizing that some of us have not even thought about that question before. And so it's a big question to answer, thinking about that, but also thinking about sometimes we are so entrenched in what we're doing in the everyday. That's our purpose right now, that it's hard to think about, well, what would come when that doesn't need
Absolutely.
to be there, or need to have that. So
yeah, and I think it's hard for sure, and especially there can be a little bit of like resistance, because better than anyone, you all know the reality of this and how far we are from that world. But that world ultimately is what we want to get to. And so knowing what it feels like to be there, that in that dance party, in this place where, there is a sense of ease, right? I remember talking to someone in a workshop, and they're like, well, I wouldn't be an activist anymore. I would just run a chicken restaurant with my cousins, And another friend of mine once said, no one becomes an activist because they wanted to be an activist, right? It's like, we're trying to get something done. So, so to know what it is that you're working towards, and to be able to get out of that day to day, like, oh, in the next 6 weeks, we got to fight back against this thing, try to win this, to know that where we're going is really key. So thank you. Can we hear from another group?
Sure, I'll go ahead. I was with Ping and Kelly, and the first thing that came to our heads when we were introducing was about jobs. Ping mentioned how, like in this, utopia, everyone's jobs would be their passion. While I was thinking also like, oh, if everyone's jobs would fully, take care of them, then they could do what they're passionate about, because they wouldn't have to worry about all the other stuff, like how do I get home safe, eat, start talking about access and equity, and even health, how everything is related back to health. Kelly did great, did mention some great issues, like from the young to the old, like all ages need to be considered, and like how in the process of politics and policy making, if everything could be just, again, like if we didn't have to think about, but if it was just an equitable decision from the get-go, and making politics ultra transparent, rather than having, even though everybody comes from different, perspectives, trying to find middle grounds that, benefit the whole rather than a few interests, and hiding it from the general public.
Great. So there's all these different pieces that we're talking about, and I think we could spend a lot more time on this, and I would encourage you to just again to, you know, kind of going back to what you were saying, where like what you would be thinking about and where your head would be given these problems were solved, you know, like what we could move on towards. What we often ask people to kind of imagine what it would be like to wake up in the morning in that world, what it's like to leave your house. What do you see, you know, as you walk through your neighborhood, so that you have, and what do you hear? What do you smell, right? And like to really have a sensory sort of feeling of what that is, because that is at the core of what you're doing, right? This work is so hard and it's going to take so long, but that's why you keep getting up every day and doing it, because we want to live in that world. And that kind of ideal scenario is what's driving you, and what is going to motivate other people, right? So we've talked to groups and they'll say, you know, oh, the really key thing for us is passing this Senate bill and the legislature, you know. And like, if you go door to door and say, I want to talk to you about the Senate bill and the legislature, they're like, it's not a thing that I care about. And it wasn't something even that I personally cared about, right? But like getting to that world, yes. And if you can connect somehow, we're moving towards this thing, and this is the next step, right? Like, not that you're telling people these like outrageous fantasies, but to have access to that and bring that into some of like the style and how you speak and the way that you approach these people of like, we're working towards this great thing, that you have to have access to that to be able to do it. So let's see. Oh, so
Right.
Rebecca, you're going to talk about how we make this more practical, because just talking about utopia is nice, but it's got to work
Right.
for us.
Utopias might be impossible to reach, right? It's a long way off, but we use it in order to set goals along the way. And we figure out our goals in order to figure out what we can do next to get us closer on the way to utopia. So next, we're going to talk about these terms that we use when we're talking about campaigns and strategies and like how we want to make change. So we talk about our goals, which are the big ideas. We talk about strategies, which are ways that we want to get to the goals. Our objectives are milestones along the way, and the tactics are the things that we do in order to achieve the objective. So we'll talk more about this. Here's another way to visualize that. You might have many objectives on the way to reach your goal, right? And
it might take multiple tactics too to get to an objective. Sometimes it takes one and you get lucky. Sometimes it takes, you know, dozens and dozens. But this is like, you know, a kind of idealized way that we move towards these things. Set objectives that we can measure. We know that we get there, and then use the tactics to kind of move towards that and keep us advancing.
So as we were thinking about the goals that we all might be working on in terms of restorative justice, we were looking at the National Center's website, and on the next page, you know, one of the things they talk about is our communities need alternatives to the traditional criminal justice model. And so we thought maybe we could think about that as one of the goals on the way towards our utopias that you all just thought through. And we'll get back to that in a second, but we wanted to talk about what do we mean in terms of goals, objectives, etc. So, Steve, do you want to bring up the mountain?
Yeah.
So,
okay, you want me to do it, or?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so we've got this sort of utopic thing that's way out on the horizon, and then we've got a goal of like, all right, we want to get to that point on that mountain, and that might take a very long time. But we can set these objectives that are more immediately achievable and are clear, measurable points along the way towards that goal, right? So how do we move through this? So the best creative campaigns we've seen link that utopic idea with the goal and incorporate the utopian ideas into the objectives. And it's a way of getting more like wildly creative tactics into your ideas, or into your campaign ideas. The whole thing together is your creative campaign. And, you know, we talk about, well, okay, so, and then the last piece is the tactic, right? In this case, it would be walking, right? But once we know, okay, we want to get to that edge of that mountain, we want to get down there, we don't have to walk, right? There are all different kinds of tactics we could come up with. So what are other ways of getting, like, say, from objective 1 to objective 2? How do you get down to that valley besides walking? Anybody? You can put your ideas in the chat. Slide, yeah. Great. Roll. Rolling down the hill. Fly. Yeah, right. Now we're getting utopian. I like it. Okay. You can also, like, yeah, helicopter. You can commission your own helicopter to come pick you up and take you there. So giant birds on the Lord of the Rings. All right, this is good. So yeah, once we know where we're trying to get, like, we can think of all different kinds of ways of getting to that objective, right? And this is, again, the creativity comes from putting the objective first. If we say, oh, you know, we're going to do the best walk to that to get there, you know, we're leaving out all these other possibilities. So one other thing is, like, should I mention strategy really quick?
Sure.
So the way that we're going about this creative campaign, like, we're thinking about a creative strategy, right? If we were trying to get to that mountain, we could say, all right, our strategy is going to be, how are we going to, is going to be around getting there the fastest, right? What's the fastest way? That's our strategy. Or our strategy could be like, what's going to be the way that takes the least amount of energy for us? Or what's going to be the most beautiful path, right? These are all different strategies. And so we talk about creative strategy, but, you know, of course, there's also complementary legal strategies. There's, like, political strategies and policy strategies. The great thing about creative strategies is that you don't have to have a law degree or expertise in these, like, very specific fields, engineering, technical, whatever, like, that creativity allows a lot more people in because everyone has it, right? And a lot of the most creative and innovative things come in our culture come from, you know, the bottom as opposed to the top. So it allows more people in. Now, Rebecca, do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, so I wanted to say, like, so the tactics are the things that you see, right? Like some of the actions that we mentioned earlier before the break, like traffic mimes and making this alternative nation in a park. Those are the tactics that are used. And sometimes when people hear us talk about things like that, like throwing a birthday party for a pothole or mimes or something like that, they say, oh, you're talking about stunts. You guys are talking about, like, doing stunts. But the thing about stunts is that it implies that there's not an impact, right? It implies that you're kind of stopping on your journey to your goal and you're just kind of doing
goofing off, yeah, doing something fun, cool.
Something that's more of a distraction, right? And maybe it, like, makes people laugh, but it's not moving people towards their goal. But what we're interested in, and all of those tactics that we shared earlier, are about getting to the next objective on the way to the utopia, right? And so sometimes when we hear about the tactics, we don't know about the bigger campaign. But when we talked about those examples before, we talked about what the problem was and how this tactic led to impact and a solution. So we want to, like, peel that back and go from the opposite direction and think about, how do we get there, right? Like, how do we come up with tactics that are actually going to help us get closer to a goal? So this is just another way to think about everything we just said. We have individual tactics that help us achieve objectives to keep us advancing towards our goal, right? And for example, if our goal is to eliminate pedestrian deaths, an achievable objective, the one in red, is reduce the number of accidents by the end of the year, right? And then the traffic mimes might be one tactic that helps us to get there. So for us, if one of our goals is alternatives to the traditional criminal justice model, let's think about what are some things that need to happen in order to help achieve that. One thing that we thought about, and we'll ask you in a second, because I know that you have lots of ideas. One thing we thought about is, like, something that needs to happen, it seems like, is people with the power to change the criminal justice model need to understand that there are alternatives and that they work and that people want and need them, right? Okay, so if we have an objective like that, so this next part that we're going to talk about is a really important part of the creative process of creative activism. And we say that because sometimes people skip over this a little bit. We don't want to just wing it, right? We don't want to like make some art or make a thing and just hope that eventually it somehow affects power. Steve, you could go to the next line. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's the hope. What we want to do is figure out something that we can do now to contribute to our objective. So this part is what we call the 3-month WOW part. This is a part of the process, and WOW is shorthand for who, how many, and what. So we want to think about things we can do in the next 3 months that helps someone, in this case, for our objective, help someone or many people in power understand the alternatives to the criminal justice system. And so we came up with an idea, and we don't know enough about the topic. You guys are, many of you are more of the experts, but we came up with an idea just in brainstorming. So let's say in 3 months, we have a specific judge in mind. Judge Smith understands restorative justice model, something particular about it, and how she can support it, right? That second part is also critical, how she can support it. And so why is it important to be specific like this? Because getting more specific helps us to come up with more and better ideas for those creative tactics. So let's say with this one, with our Judge Smith, we've researched a specific judge in our region and know that she's somebody who we could probably get to really support and be an ally. When we focus on a person or a small group of people as our audience, we can learn more specifics about them and what can possibly motivate them, which is really critical. So with Judge Smith, we might check out her Twitter feed or Instagram or something else. And maybe we learn that she really responds to like stories of children and families being treated unfairly. Like that's something that she's talked about. Or maybe she loves landscape paintings or something else. But let's say those are some of the things that we find out she likes. We could come up with a tactic that is making a personal landscape painting for her. It could depict the alternatives to the current models. That could help inform her, right? It could help her actually feel emotionally connected. One thing that it doesn't do to help us towards our objective is encouraging her to do something about it, though. And that's critical. We're not just wanting to raise her awareness of the issue. We want to see some change. So we need to incorporate something. We could send letters with our painting from people telling their personal stories and asking for her to be an ally in very specific ways, right? So now you can see that this approach is more pointed than say like just putting a mural up, a painting on a wall somewhere in a city. It's more pointed, it's more directed. And it specifically is directed at a person who has the power to make change. Now, we're not saying like every action needs to be directed at one person. There are clearly lots of different audiences here. But here we're able to get really specific with this particular one. There are lots of other ways we could reach people in power. We could decide that a person in power, group of people are like state senators, for example. And maybe the way that you reach them is by getting media attention on the issue, which will put pressure on them, or maybe it's getting the people who vote for them to rise up and say something. There's also other possible objectives, like the people in power one is just one. There are other things that we can do in order to help us get closer to our goal. So we want to hear from you. What are some other objectives that can help us get closer to alternatives to the traditional criminal justice models? Like, what are some things that need to happen broadly? So there's getting maybe people in power to understand alternatives, but what are some other things? If you want to put them in the chat or unmute yourself, tell us. one thing that I thought about is there's also getting people who, without power to speak up and demand alternatives, right?
Yeah, that I was thinking of, I was trying to like filter through my thought on that to see if it was matching what you were looking for. And I was thinking about the people who have already participated in alternative structures like restorative justice and more,
Yeah.
who have both taken responsibility or been harmed by crime and conflict, to give them a platform so that more people were hearing about their experiences and experiencing resonance and empathy.
Mm-hmm. Great.
One thing that comes to mind is just more humanizing of people who commit crimes, because I think oftentimes fear and dehumanization are parts of the like cultural narrative that make people too afraid to try alternatives.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Great. See in the chat, learning the benefits of the alternatives, not just for the people who go through the system, but for the officers in it as well. That's really interesting. Great. Cultural shift around punishment and our concept of accountability. Fantastic. Creating a tangible interest, probably financial at first, then eventually getting to the collective thought. Interesting. So like an economic argument, Fabiola? Like helping people understand the economics of alternatives.
Yes. I was thinking how laws are very interesting because it's kind of like a vicious cycle, but not necessarily vicious. Laws are put into place, and so you have no option but to, do it or get a fine if you don't, follow the laws, follow the rules. And eventually it changes culture. Like once was like, oh, we've always done this way because there's a law. And at the same time, our culture, the things that we do every day inform the laws. And then they're like, okay, perfect. Now we have a law. We all dress in pink on Wednesdays, until it just doesn't become an imposition. It's just part of our collective thought. And it's really difficult to achieve, like, oh, let's just change the culture. Like, how can we do it like little by little? But you must.
Yeah, totally.
Money.
Well, I think that we've heard some thoughts about some steps on the way there, right? And so I think this idea of people who've been part of the justice system having a platform to speak and give other people a sense for who they are and their stories seems like it's part of that cultural shift, right? So I wonder if there's some great ideas in the chat. And one thing that we like to do is to take some of these ideas about how we move forward and start to turn some of them into this 3-month wow, which is the much more specific and measurable objective about what we can accomplish in 3 months. So how about maybe you can help us brainstorm around this idea of people who've been part of the justice system having a platform to speak. We know that they are the people who are speaking, but who's an audience that we could reach in 3 months? Or who's an audience you could reach? It could be you locally. Like you could say, I personally would like to put up an exhibit in my town and have 2,000 people attend or 100 people attend and be able to have meaningful conversations with them.
Or think about, you've got holidays coming up.
Mm-hmm.
There's end of the year stuff, New Year's Day, there's Martin Luther King holiday, right? So these are things that are going to be happening anyway in those 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, it's Ping. Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and I was I'm a student, so definitely how I reach people in power can be difficult. And so I was thinking what about the student body, or what about those community members that you can access locally? Because I think a lot of those examples that you were showing were so cool, with the rubber ducks and everything, but it wasn't they reached out to the government officials immediately and ask them to make this huge change, right? It was about creating that community and a group of people who are behind it. And I really loved that idea. So like, what could I do at like BLS, or what you were saying with the new year, like, I don't know, like you have to create like a restorative resolution for like the new year or something like that, you know?
Great. I also love in the chat some ideas around community organizers as maybe audiences, or school counselors as people who you want to reach. So what if you said, you know, in my region, I want to connect with 20 school counselors, and share with them, have them see specific stories from people who have been through the system that help them understand what it's like, and these people's experience of it. And like, that's a very, you know, once we start to define that, those kinds of numbers and who we're trying to reach and what we want them to get from it, then we can start thinking about what are some ways that we can achieve that, right?
Another thing too is like thinking about more ambitious, right? So one is for them to, you meet and talk with them, but another is like for them to say, oh, I could implement this or that in this school. So to say like, all right, we're gonna talk to 20 and have at least two say that they're gonna try one of these techniques or something, right? So then you have like not only just them understanding, but then a behavior attached to it.
Exactly. So that actually brings us to our mission that we have for you for this week. And we say it's a mission because we know that many of you are thinking about what are some creative things that I could do around restorative justice, and specifically to submit to the National Center as part of this call, or also more broadly. And so we have some ideas for you for moving forward. One is we have some very fun short videos for you to watch, which we think you'll love, because when we share these, people are like, oh my gosh, those were so informative and helpful and fun. So the first one is about Craftivism, which is activism through craft, and some really interesting takeaways, especially around what we were just talking about in terms of like reaching people in power in different kinds of ways, like thinking different ways to do that. And then the Frank talk is actually Steve giving a talk about some work that we did in South Africa. But it really, for me, it's a nice way to think about how do we move from very clear objectives into really fun tactics to help achieve those. And so that's the first thing, is just, I think collectively those two videos are 20 minutes long or something. And then the next thing is to create an objective. And Steve, you could advance the slides possibly. We could think about, you could start with, what are the things that get us closer to the alternatives? And as you start to brainstorm, as we started to do here today, about reaching people in power, making sure that people understand what those alternatives are and why. Maybe it's the economics, maybe it's the stories. Think about those aspects of this that you're really interested in, and then get more narrow. Do your 3-month wow. And what's a specific thing that you could contribute to this movement that you want to make? Something that's more achievable. And again, that's the wow stands for who, how many, and what. So who might be, I want to reach 1,000 people online. And those are not just anybody. I want to reach students, or I want to reach people who have been affected by the system. And what do you want them to do? And it's important to get specific about the audience. It could be 20 of your friends. It could be one senator. It could be 1,000 people online. The reason why we encourage you to think about your audience is, as you saw in those examples that we gave, the more clear you are on your audience, the better chance you have of really resonating with them, because you can find out more about what motivates them and what they care about in terms of this issue, and connect with them over that through your work. One thing that we like to think about is, what do you want your audience to think, feel, and do as a result of encountering your work? Sometimes
all three of those are important, right? So think is like the facts and understanding the data. Feel is like this is, maybe there can be a range of feelings. One is like, this is awful, but another is like, oh, wow, I feel really empowered to actually help with this and motivated. So range of feelings. And then do it, an action. What is the action that you want them to take? Because if we leave at think and feel, like motivated but no outlet, or overwhelmed by the problem but know where to take that, that's how people get cynical. So we always want to add like a step for them to take.
I'm realizing I think I can actually give credit to Andrea Jones, who's on this call, for this think, feel, do.
Really?
And yes, Andrea, I think, Andrea, do you think you're the first person who talked to me about this many years ago?
I don't know. I mean, that seems like one of the possible things that could have happened. Yes. I know I talk about it a lot still, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Chicken
We
or egg.
use it all the time now.
We do. It's so key. And like, it's so helpful to the work, right? It's like such a, yeah.
It's an honor.
I'm pretty sure I stole it from somewhere.
borrowed, yes. Okay, so the mission, watch these 2 short videos, define a 3-month objective. In that, pick your audience and think about what you want your audience to think, feel, and do. And if you want to write those down, we would love to hear a week from now what you came up with, and we can talk about it some more and dig into them. So we have a couple minutes for questions or discussion. Anyone?
Rebecca, I'm sorry. Would you mind putting that slide back up for a second? The mission. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you. This workshop reinforced a lot of what I've been feeling and thinking for a long time. And so, yay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. One of the things that we hope for is like, there's a combination of like, oh, wow, I never knew that. And oh, wow, I always knew that, so glad to hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just also like to offer appreciation. I was directing a restorative justice nonprofit for the last 8 years. And so I've thought about a lot of these questions just for the sake of like community education to gain support locally. But I like the framing of the process that you're offering is pushing me further to think outside of like where I've just kind of gotten tired and stuck, I'm like, oh, I'm trying to do this again. I'm trying to, trying to be creative, but kind of running out of steam. So I appreciate the different angle.
Oh, good. We often find that, like, that's what we talk about in terms of the creative activism. Often what it can do best is help activists feel refreshed and engaged and creative, right? Like to bring your whole self into your work and to like be excited about it and to remember that innovation and play and joy are key to the work too. Yeah.
I actually had a quick question. I was wondering, so in one of the examples you were talking about, like it involved like another culture. So how do you guys navigate like working with such different populations and like the difficulties of what's acceptable? Isn't, if I would just love a little bit more information.
Sure. So for example, right now we're doing a series of like an 8-week workshop with Greenpeace activists in Southeast Asia, in 4 different countries in Southeast Asia. And so what we do is like, we kind of provide some prompts and some questions, like as you saw today. So we ask people to investigate and to bring forward stories and symbols from their own culture that they think resonate, to think about what they want to achieve in terms of their objectives. And then we kind of guide them through this process of remembering how to draw from their own creativity and their own cultures in order to better inform the actions that they're doing. So, we're not experts on restorative justice. You are all over the world. But what we do is we help to say, well, we ask, who do you want to reach? And let's investigate who those people are and what motivates them, what they want, what they need, what their values are, and how might you connect with them. So our work is, we don't actually do the actions, right? We provide a framework and an encouragement for other people to do actions and campaigns.
And I think too, when we're working with folks, being really clear where our expertise ends, and so that we need to collaborate with them in order to be able to do the work at all. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Platform. It's a platform, right? Yeah, to use your own skills and passions. Because there's not a lot of, people who have been to art school often don't have the training. There's not a lot of discussion there if you want to use your art and all of those powers of art for social change. There's not a lot of training around that or even examples. And so filling that gap is part of what we try to do. And also for the activist and advocacy world, we often don't have these conversations about play and about joy and about very different dynamic ways of approaching the work that are actually, a lot of what we bring is this sense of like being very audience focused, really serving the people who you want to reach and thinking deeply about who they are and what motivates them in order to connect with them. Any other questions or thoughts
about anything that we covered in the last couple hours?
I just echo everyone else, their appreciation and thank you for this workshop. And one thing that I'm taking away is just the lightheartedness of art in activism. And maybe I'm saying it wrong, but I just was very inspired by, the stories that I hear all the time, and the work that I'm doing in restorative justice is just very heavy, right? And our own personal experiences of a lack of justice in our own lives, like it's all just so painful and heavy. And I just appreciate you opening up my mind to, making more space for laughter and lightness in the midst of that, because that's how to invite more people in and to give us a pathway forward. Because sometimes, as I'm teaching restorative justice and supporting people through their, darkest moments, it's like we can lose hope sometimes. And so I think we don't have to. And I just appreciate you sharing a different way. It's beautiful.
So glad to hear that.
Yeah, I'm reminded of two things. One is this quote from Jack Gilbert: he's a poet, "To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil." So yeah, there's that. And then the other thing, reminded of a time we were in Moldova, and I think we had shown some projects that were kind of funny. It wasn't everything, but this woman came up to us after and was like, "I work on torture. Does this work for that? Like, can you be funny about torture?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely. You can make a joke about anything. It's just harder. Like, it's much harder to make a joke about torture, but it is, you can." And I think that's like the discipline, that's the effort, and it is hard. It is hard work, but it absolutely needs to be done, and it's possible. Yeah. I'll put that quote in the chat because it's handy to keep around every once in a while.
So thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your time. And it's been wonderful seeing your comments and hearing more about what you're working on. So I'm very looking forward to seeing you next week and hearing your thoughts and thoughts about your audiences and what you'd like to achieve.
Yeah, and also, we so value that you're doing this work and committed in this way, and also open to, seeing other ways and how to incorporate this. We appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay, take care. Feel free to reach out. I'll put our email address in the chat too. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. In the meantime.
And we can hang out here for a little bit too if
Thank
you're
you.
like want to ask questions that you don't want to ask in front of a lot of people.
Thank you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, National Center.
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna hang out to say thank you. That was excellent.